Alright, so, in case it wasn't already clear, I'm aiming to create a combat system similar to Fire Emblem and Advance Wars in the sense that you'll be commanding a group of units moving freely around mostly a two-dimensional plane seen from a top-down perspective. This direction isn't 100% set in stone, but it's how I've been imagining it, and I don't plan on making any radical departures from it aside from, obviously, what I described earlier with the time system. Because that is my ultimate goal, is to make the time stuff work. So the only situation in which I would see myself not using the top-down 2D perspective is if it's really not working. But as I said, there is one small aspect I feel like I have to consider changing, and that is whether the game takes place on a square grid or not. So to get an overview, let's take a look at the pros for each. Yeah, we're getting into the nitty-gritty here, so no more slick visuals for you guys. So naturally, I was initially sold on grids, since the simplicity and clarity that they provide really is an aspect of these games that I really like. However, a grid-based movement system runs into a serious issue, which is if you can see enemy attacks ahead of time, they're very, very easy to avoid. This is the same problem that Into the Breach ran into during their development. This is a major inspiration. And their solution was to place these static structures that the player has to defend. But I want to try something different, especially since my time chunk system opens up new possible solutions. And now then, let's look at the problem in detail. So the crux of the issue is that the absolute minimum that a character can move at when using a grid system is 1 grid tile per time chunk. Since the whole point of a grid system in the first place is that a character can't really be in between grid tiles at all at any given moment. This means that it's trivial to avoid even some of the fastest attacks as long as a character being targeted can currently move, because reflexes aren't really a factor. Now, the reason a non-grid system fixes this is that you can just make characters arbitrarily slow, enough so that dodging attacks becomes a challenge again. But I still want to try and make grids work, so what are some possible solutions? Well, I could have attacks take up a very large area, such that it's difficult to escape even if characters can move very quickly. But this has all sorts of undesirable knock-on effects, which adds a bunch of unnecessary complexity. Like I'd have to increase the map size, and then you'd get a bunch of like overlapping attacks, and then traversal becomes a pain in the ass, etc, etc, etc. So that's a non-starter. And another solution is to go kind of halfway between grid and non-grid. So I do this by increasing the fidelity of the grid. So that a single character takes up more grid tiles. So like here it would be, this character takes up 1, 2, 3, 4 grid tiles. And this lets you move characters part way through what would have originally been just one big grid tile, like so, right? While still keeping a lot of the advantages of a grid system. Though past a certain point, I'd say 4 by 4 tiles per character, you might as well just not use a grid at all. And that would look like this. I like this solution, so I took some steps to see if it was feasible. I needed a baseline set of quote-unquote frame data. So I created hypothetical melee attack archetypes that you'd see on a kind of mid-range balanced standard character from a fighting game. And these range from like very fast jabs to slower, stronger attacks. Though I only really care about the range and the startup speed for now, so that's all I've generated. I've based this data, this is just me kind of going in and filling this in by hand, and I based this off some basic characters from various fighting games, though I really just use the broad strokes, just so that I wouldn't end up with something wildly unbalanced. So here, let me just explain the units real quick. If you look at the range, 1 unit, these are all decimals, but 1 unit would be about the size of 1 character. So this attack, for example, would stretch 1 character and a half in front of whoever's attacking, and then 0.8 units to the side. And startup time is the number of time chunks before an attack triggers. 1 time chunk here is about the equivalent of 5 frames from a 60 FPS fighting game. So if the attack I was referencing took like 5 or 6 frames to start up, it would be about 1 time chunk. If it took like 9 or 11 frames, it would be like 2 time chunks, so on and so forth. And then the dodge difficulty here assumes that whoever's getting hit by the attack is right in front of the attacker. So this is essentially how hard it is to dodge an attack if you're right in front of the guy and he's attacking you. So after looking over this data, things seem quite promising actually. The small numbers in the startup time are good because they're simple, but they still allow for, they're just barely precise enough to allow for interesting differentiation between attacks. And most melee attacks stretch about 1.5 character lengths in front of a character and then half a character length to each side, which would look something like this about. So if we do use the 4x4 limit I was describing earlier, then we can actually achieve the desired difficulty while still having a bit of wiggle room. So if a character, let's say, moves 3 grid tiles per time chunk, they wouldn't just be able to walk out of a fast hit, because 1, 2, 3, they're still getting hit here. But they can reasonably avoid an attack that takes 2 time chunks to start up, because just, 1, 2, 3, they're out of there. And then you can also have slow characters that move at about 1 or 2 grid tiles per time chunks, and fast characters that move maybe 4 or 5 grid tiles per time chunk.